Okay, good morning. I'm Jack Stewart, for those of you that don't know me. I'm an AMP, IA, and I happen to be in love with these things. And I'm going to show you a few things today that I have a lot of questions about. People always calling me up and asking questions, and that's fine. You can call me or email me, and later on I'll give you my email address, and we'll go from there. I'd like to thank Randy Phillips for providing this for you. One of the things I'd like to talk about is how to make a homemade tool to jack up our Stinsons. We have to jack them up. Actually, every annual, you're supposed to pull the wheels off, pack the bearings, check the brakes and all that. This is simply a 3/4 inch piece of black pipe, available at any hardware store, lumber yard, something. And I cut a slit in it. It's about 3/8 of an inch, both sides. And it slides on the bolt that's inside the frame of our Stinson. So we can simply slide it in here. Goes over the bolt and don't turn. And you can just use a floor jack. Jack it up. And you can pull the wheel off, take the wheel pan off. It even makes it easy to check the tire pressure like this. So that's one tool. And another thing I'd like to show you is back here, they advertise tail draggers. That's a brand name. Well, I made this one myself for about $20 worth of iron from the farm store, a couple of lawnmower wheels, and probably if I was making it over, I would make these wheels a little closer together, but that's fine. These wheels are about 2 feet apart. And let's see, it's about not quite 4 feet. And of course, this dimension right here will depend on the tire you have. I think what I done was I put this around the tire, and then I tack welded this piece in and finish welded everything up. So you just slide it under your airplane like this. And this piece here will squeeze in on the tire, so you can pick it up and roll it out or roll it back in. You got plenty of leverage. I'm an old man and I can do it, so I know you guys can. And I never leave it on there. I don't want to leave a dent in the tire. So again, about 20 bucks worth of stuff, make you a $150 tail dragger. Now, Brent Chillicott has asked me a couple of questions, as well as some of the rest of you. One of them has to do with oil pressure. Oil pressure is actually adjustable on a Franklin engine. You have to open up the cowling. Now, the best way to do this is remove the lower cowling. Unless you're a whole lot more agile than I am, I'd have to remove the lower cowling, and it's on the left front corner of your engine, the pilot's side front corner. And we have one here set up so I can show you a little better. Here's the oil pressure relief valve, and there's 2 plugs on it. The front one, don't mess with it. You don't need to. So you remove the rear one, and it should be safety wired in place. If not, these tabs are bent over. It takes a 15/16 wrench and this lock washer is also the washer that seals it. I have used a crush washer on them, which works fine. This washer is available from Susan, as most of these parts are, and as you can see, these are locking tabs. So once you screw it in there, you bend these tabs over. This end here should fit right in there. So here's the spring. Now remove this thing slowly, guys, because you don't want that spring shooting across the floor. Now if you want to increase the oil pressure, this is about a washer for about a 1032 screw, and it just fits in there nicely. And you can put it back. And what you're doing is you're compressing that spring more. There's a little valve right in here, and this spring puts pressure on the valve. So when the oil's cold, it'll open up that valve. And the warmer it gets, that valve closes down, so it don't overpressurize the system. And you just torque this back down. I snug them up about the same torque as I put on a spark plug, because remember, this is a copper gasket. You only want to tighten it up enough to squeeze that copper gasket down. It don't have to be gorilla tight. Just snug it up good to where you've squeezed that gasket down. Obviously this one's not in place. And then you can safety wire it from here to here and bend these tabs over. One washer usually is equal to about 5 pounds of oil pressure. So if you want to increase your oil pressure 10 pounds, put a couple of washers under it. It's real easy to do. Now, Chris Collum is working on an STC for an adjustable valve that goes in here, real similar to what Continental uses. It's just got a screw on it, and you can screw that screw in or out to adjust the oil pressure as you need to. I haven't talked to Chris lately, but I don't know where he's at with it, but I do know that he's working on one. Oil pressure, okay. If you do not have a remote oil filter on your engine, please guys, consider putting one on. It'll save you a whole bunch in the long run. Usually when you install a remote oil filter, such as Airwolf, you'll lose about 5 or 10 pounds of oil pressure. So you can stick a couple of washers in like we just showed, and you can get that oil pressure back up to where you want it. So where should the oil pressure be? It's funny to note that our pilot operating handbook, operations manual, whatever you want to call it, says 40 to 45. Yeah, 40 to 45 pounds is where the oil pressure should be. But if you look in a Franklin, the STC for a Franklin engine, it says 30 to 50. 30's okay. The old timers will tell you that 10 pounds of oil pressure for each 1,000 RPMs. So if you're turning 3,000 RPM, 30 pounds of oil pressure is good if you believe what the old timers say. And these things have been flying around for 70 plus years, so I believe what the old timers tell me, usually. I'm an old timer now, so maybe you don't want to believe everything I say though. Okay, another question I have a lot of times is oil temperature. What should the oil temperature be? Well, this is the original type 102 oil cooler out of a Stinson. If you find one of these and it's in good shape, hang on to it. They really work well. The oil temperature probe, this, of course, this hangs down underneath the engine. Right in here is where the oil cooler is. This is a Niagara, which you'll find on most of them anymore. But the oil temperature is measured right here. This is the back of the oil cooler, and it's actually measured as the oil is going back into the engine. After it's already been through the cooler is where you get the oil temperature measurement at. And a lot of people think that's what the oil temperature is in the pan. It's not. The oil temperature in the pan is anywhere from 30 to 50 degrees higher because it's already been through the oil cooler. So ideally, I like to see about 180 degrees on my oil temperature gauge. You don't ever want to see over 240. If you see 250 degrees, your oil's cooking and it's breaking down, which is really bad. If for some reason you have a oil temperature that high, you probably need to change your oil immediately and find out why it's overheating. So anyway, the temperature probe goes in here, measures the oil as it's going back, the oil temperature as it's going back into the pan. So usually I hook up an oil filter here, and the STC for an Airwolf oil filter tells you how to hook the oil filter up to this thing. So oil temperature around 180. If you come out to the hangar and you fire your airplane up once a week, once a month if you're not flying, and you warm it up till the oil temperature gauge moves and comes up to say 140, all you're doing is hurting your engine. If you're not going to fly for an extended period of time, please guys, pickle that engine. There's instructions on how to do that, but if you only heat that oil up to 140, you're not baking the water out of it. And you need to get all the moisture and water out of the engine, because if not, that's where corrosion, rust, and so on comes from in the engine. I prefer, if I'm going to do an oil change, I'd like to take the airplane up, fly it around the pattern, actually have the owner do it, fly it around the pattern 2 or 3 times and make sure it's warmed up really well, and come in and shut it down and then do an oil change. If not, I have changed oil on a cold engine, and when you first pull the plug out, I've seen a coffee cup full of water come out, believe it or not. It'll condense inside the engine just sitting in the hangar. Especially if you just warm it up a little bit and shut it down, then the water condenses inside the engine. Well, oil floats on top of water, so the first thing that's going to be inside your engine is going to be the water, right? And you don't want water in there. Brett also brought up oil leaks. Well, it's an air-cooled engine. This happens to be a 150 case here, which there's very little difference between a 150 and a 165. But anyway, it's an air-cooled engine. Air-cooled engines react differently than what engines in our cars do, water-cooled. Therefore, it's really hard to get them to completely stop leaking oil at some point in time. But one of the places that are really prone to leakage is where the oil tubes go in the lifters. Your cylinder sets on here, and the tube goes down through the cylinder and goes in here, your push rod tubes. So I'm going to show you real quick how to fix that. Pick my tools up so I don't fall over them. So the cylinder would be sitting on the engine like this, and the push rod tubes are on the bottom. And usually they leak here first by the block. Usually they don't have too much problems leaking up here around where the tube goes through the cylinder. Now you got to remember, you've got an aluminum engine case, aluminum cylinder, and these are aluminum. Well, when you start the engine up, everything starts heating up, everything starts expanding. And because of the size difference, everything starts expanding at a different rate. The engine case will expand at one rate because of such a mass. The cylinders will expand at a different rate because of the cooling fins on them, and they also have a steel sleeve in them. So that sleeve is made out of a different material. It has to heat up at a different rate. So you got all these things heating and expanding at different rates. It's bound to, after a period of time, the gaskets moving back and forth, they'll start leaking. Okay, if you want to replace your pushrod tube gaskets, to make it easy, it takes a couple of special tools. The first thing you would have to do is get the pushrod tube out of there. Now, just because it's been leaking doesn't mean it's going to come out easy. I've seen vice grips used, channel locks, and all you're going to do is tear up your pushrod tubes, and then you're going to be calling Susan and saying, "Hey, you got any pushrod tubes?" "Sure, I've got pushrod tubes, but they're not that cheap." I happen to have a special tool for removing pushrod tubes. I've also seen a rubber hose with a bolt down through the middle of it that fits just inside here. You stick it in about that long and you tighten up the bolt, and sometimes that'll work for pulling them out. But these babies are stuck in there pretty good. So what this tool does, it goes inside the pushrod tube, and then you tighten it up, and it expands in this groove here. And then all it is a matter of tightening this up, and it'll pull the pushrod tube out. Now, you only have to pull it out about that far, and then it'll come out the rest of the way real easy. Because that's all the thicker the gaskets are. Here's 2 new gaskets that goes on the pushrod tubes. Now, when you replace the gaskets, this is an older tube. The newer tubes are bigger at one end than they are at the other. The big end obviously goes in here because it won't go all the way through there. So, anytime you're putting on a rubber seal or rubber gasket, make sure you coat it with some type of lubricant or oil. I always try to coat seals with the same type of oil or grease or whatever they're going to be running in. And it just slips on like that. Now, if you try to put that dry seal on, it may not go on there as easy. So use a little oil on it. This is just standard oil. And in fact, there's a little left over in this can. I just changed oil in something. Like I said, just give it a little coating. Any kind of seal. If you're working on O-rings for brakes, coat them with some brake fluid. But you always want to coat the seal with something. Makes it easier to go on. Now, I've got it coated, and it'll also make it easier going in the hole. I put that one on too quick. I usually put the pushrod tube through the head and then put the seal on the other end. All right? Now, this goes down in here in the engine, and this will go in the cylinder head. Well, there's another little tool that we've come up with for that. This is just a piece of brass that I turned out on the lathe. It works. It's not fancy. Anybody could make one of these. And it just goes in the pushrod like that, the pushrod tube. Oh, I got one of the older ones. Goes in there, and what you do is you get it started, get the rubber started, and they may not want to go in. So get somebody to help you and tap on this with a hammer as you're coaxing those seals in the place where they belong. Now, the one up here in the head's not too bad, but you can see it's wanting to wrinkle and bulge up. This one's not too bad. This one down here is the one that gives you problems, because the engine more than likely will still be in the plane, and you'll be upside down here like this, while your buddy's tapping on this with a hammer. Now that one wants to go in pretty easy. But see, it's pushing out on this side. This side down here is going right in. Pushing out on this side. Now, if you're using a screwdriver, be very careful. You don't want to use a screwdriver like that. Use the flat side of the screwdriver and kind of coax that in. If you need to, you can pry around there a little bit, and as you're tapping that in, and you're there, it just went, whoop. See, now that's what we want to avoid. It rolled that seal over. We don't want to do that. We want to coax this in easy and even, and use your screwdriver to kind of nudge it in there. See, as your buddy's tapping on it out here. And when it's all done, it should be even like this all the way around. It should be flush with the outside. And that's why they're difficult to get out. I also have another tool. This one's a little fancier and works a lot better, especially for one guy. It screws into one of the rocker arm holes. Somebody's made this. Some good machinist has made this. This is not a tool you can go buy, although I think Susan has tools that she will loan you or rent you that look like this. If you really need this thing, I would loan it to you. So here we go again. So instead of hitting on it with a hammer, you put the tool in there like that, and you can put some gentle pressure on it to push that down in there while you're using your screwdriver to manipulate that seal around. This obviously is not on the engine, so it's moving around, but see, that seal's wanting to pop out of there. So we want to take the screwdriver and gently work it in as we're putting pressure on it. Yeah. Like I said, if you can't find one of these things, I would loan it. This is where the oil leaks most of the time, is those push rod tubes. If you have oil seeping out behind a cylinder, you might want to consider pulling that cylinder off. Which brings me to another point. I think some of you are using the rope trick for the valves a little too much. You're relying on it. If you have a valve and it's sticking on a regular basis, pull the cylinder off. It's no big deal. Loosen up these bolts around here and pull that cylinder off. Now, you want to make sure that the piston is on top dead center or thereabouts. You want it sticking out as far as you can. So when you slide that cylinder off, you can leave the piston right in the cylinder, rings and all, and push the wrist pin out, slide the cylinder off with the piston still in it, and have a look. It's going to cost you some gaskets if you don't find anything wrong. All right? But, like I said, if you have a valve and it's sticking on a regular basis, it don't take long to pull a cylinder off. It's a few dollars in gaskets, and it might save you some headaches down the line. If you have a valve that's sticking, there's a reason for it. It may be a reason besides crud buildup around the stem of the valve or in the valve guide. Maybe you have a valve that's got a bent stem. Maybe you have a valve that's just kind of warped. In any event, don't hesitate to pull that cylinder off. It's no big deal. In the last few years, some of you guys have been putting parts on your airplanes that maybe really shouldn't be put on your airplanes. One example is this. Oil cooler shutter. It's nice, it works good, but until somebody gets an actual field approval on it, you're putting an uncertified piece on your airplane, guys. I don't care what excuse you're using, it's uncertified. And you're changing the airplane from what the type certificate data sheet says. So anytime you change from what the type certificate data sheet says, you're making an alteration to that airplane. Now, these are not my words, these are right out of the book, this book. And it says right here, major alterations, changes to the basic design of the fuel, oil, cooling, and heating systems. Well, that's what you're doing. You're changing the design of the oil cooling system. Like I said, it works good. If you can get an FAA designated engineer to give you an approval on this thing, hey, I'm all for you. I think they're great. I think they work great. And I'd love to put them on everybody that wants one. But until that day comes, you shouldn't be having it on your airplane. Because in paragraph 2, section 3, it says, installation of an accessory which is not approved for the engine, it's prohibited. You can't do it. Now, especially when it comes to the case of like propellers, modifying the wing, modifying a control surface, those are all big no-nos, and you're probably not going to get an engineer to go along with you. I've heard of guys putting Cessna flaps on their Stinsons. Why, I don't know, but I don't know, for some reason they want to, that's fine. And in some cases, this advisory circular right here, this is advisory circular 23-27. It gives us permission to make some parts if they're not available. And face it, they haven't built one of these things since 1949. So a lot of parts are not available. And we can make them. And it says right here, applicability. Easy for somebody to say. If your airplane was certificated before January of 1980 and has a weight of 12,500 pounds or less, unpressurized, reciprocating engine, then there are certain parts you can make yourself or have made. There's such a thing as owner manufactured parts. If you get a drawing for something and you take it to a machine shop and say, make this for me, and you can get a mechanic to put it on your airplane, in some cases that's legal. But I would always check with the local FSDO. Despite all the stories you've heard, the local FSDO is actually there to help us. They want to keep us safe. The general public gets excited when airplanes start falling out of the sky on their head. And that's exactly what the FAA wants to prevent. Through the years, I've got field approvals for installing oil cooler. If your oil cooler does not have that part number on it, 102, then it's not really legal just to change parts out on a Franklin Stinson aircraft. So if you use, say, a Niagara, which I usually do, make brackets for it, I have been successful in getting a field approval because I'm replacing one oil cooler with another oil cooler. And if the oil cooler fails, usually you'll have time to land in a cornfield or something. It's not going to fall on somebody's head. That's up to the FSDO to determine stuff like that. And in the FARs, it talks about major and minor repairs. Minor repairs is just that, or minor alterations. But you go back over here and it talks about fuel and oil cooling. They don't consider putting something like this on as a minor alteration. And anytime you alter the airplane from what the type certificate says, you have to file a 337. Now, if you file a 337 and the local FSDO says, hey, you need to go look at this guy's airplane, and he comes out and says, that won't work. You're going to have to get it off your airplane or not fly, one or the other. There is no argument. There's no way to argue with them. They make the rules. We have to do what they say to do. And there's been a letter published about these propellers. Sorry to say I was involved in part of it. And somebody said, well, if the guy would have just kept his mouth shut, we'd have been all right. There's, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 guys flying around with these Hercules propellers on their airplanes. And according to everything I've heard, they're working just great. They've had no problems. But the FAA says that the propeller is a critical part. If the propeller would fail in flight, you would probably have a catastrophic engine failure and you'd be on the ground before you realize it. Therefore, they said that until they get more information on these propellers, there's no way that they can approve them. And hopefully, we're working on getting approval for it. I would love to see it because they're a beautiful piece of work. The main reason that we don't want to use unapproved parts on our airplanes are, say something would happen, an incident, any kind of incident where somebody gets hurt. Actually, if you have a bad landing, screw your airplane up, but nobody gets hurt, technically you don't really have to go to the FAA and you don't have to fill out any paperwork. But if you damage somebody else's property or there is a personal injury, then they're going to be all over you. But the FAA is not the people we have to worry about. Say you're flying somebody or their kid in your airplane. Something happens and they get hurt bad, terrible bad. No matter if the unapproved part had nothing to do with the incident, the insurance company is going to come out, take one look at your airplane and say, oh, well, you got this gizmo here on your plane and it don't belong on there. We're not going to pay off. And I don't know about you guys, but I couldn't afford for a lawyer to take me to court and sue me for everything I've got. And I don't want that to happen to any of you either. I want everybody to be safe. I want to see these old airplanes flying well after I'm gone. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Randy. Thanks for Brett for inviting me out there. I apologize again that I'm not there in person. Maybe next time. Things will be different in a year, I hope. They got to be different. Anyway, see you later. Bye.